Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Acuity webinar on navigating cyber risk in a complex, chaotic world, hosted by Doris Kozma, Marketing Manager here at Acuity, and Simon Marvell, our presenter today, the CEO of Acuity. So, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Simon has various experience, 30 plus years of experience in the industry, and he'll be talking today about how to achieve a 360-degree view of your cyber risk and how to manage cyber risk in this very chaotic, ever-changing environment that we are noticing with hacks such as Kaseya and ransomware being on the rise, etc. So please do remember to put in your questions in the question box as we go along. And at the end, we have a Q&A session where I will relay your questions to Simon and he'll address them here live. You can also download the resources that Simon will be mentioning towards the end from the handout section. And if you have any other questions, concerns, or feedback, please do drop them in the question box as well. At the end of the webinar, you will also be prompted to fill in a survey. So please do let us know what you thought about the webinar and what you would like to see in the future from Acuity. Thank you very much. I will hand over to Simon now.
Doris, thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. As Doris said, I'm Simon Marvell, founder and CEO of Acuity. Before starting Acuity, I had 13 years running a consultancy firm, Insight Consulting, that specialized in information risk, business enterprise risk management, and business continuity. We then started Acuity, and at Acuity we have a software platform stream for integrated risk management and governance, risk and compliance, and we provide associated services to that with a particular focus on cyber and enterprise risk management. So after this brief introduction, we'll just sort of talk a little bit about how complex and chaotic the world has become, how we're seeing unprecedented levels of change and happening very quickly. And we'll look at how we can navigate this chaos and lead on to how we achieve 360-degree contextual intelligence on cyber risk, which we think is very important to managing cyber risk. I'll then talk about implementation, as Doris said, leave some time for Q&A at the end. So let's move on. The world is changing at an unprecedented pace. And as far as the digital world is concerned, we're very much into the digital era now. The world is being transformed by new technology. And what was gathering pace before the pandemic has now accelerated during the pandemic. And according to PwC, 82% of CEOs now think that digital transformation is strategically important to their businesses and are prepared to invest in digital transformation as well. The analyst IDC are estimating worldwide spending between 2020 and 2023, $7.4 trillion. And the World Economic Forum are estimating that $100 trillion of value is going to be created over the next decade from digital transformation. And this is going to come from a changing in customer expectations, an enabling of businesses to address those expectations, and it's going to change the way people live and work. And not surprisingly, businesses are rushing to exploit these new opportunities, but also trying to protect themselves against new, faster, disruptive, tech-enabled competitors. So there's an awful lot going on. Businesses are changing rapidly when it comes to digitization, but of course, in the rush to do that, we need to be conscious of some new and changed risks that are emerging in the digital era. I took this slide from a report by Deloitte at the end of 2019. It's called Future of Risk in the Digital Era, Transformative Change, Disruptive Risk. And Deloitte identified a number of new or changed risks. I'm not going to go through all of these. It's a very interesting report if you want to look it up afterwards, but I'll just highlight 2 or 3 of them. Firstly, managing the black box of artificial intelligence, which is about understanding the decision making that's going on within AI applications. And Deloitte gave a couple of examples. The first one was a healthcare program that suffered a backlash when an algorithm reduced patients' benefits without any clear reasoning. And secondly, the example was an organization pulled advertising from a website when the algorithm put ads next to inappropriate content. There's an awful lot going on with process automation, robotic process automation, which is really becoming the new norm as far as manufacturing is concerned. And Deloitte highlighted the need for evolving governance and controls for automation, gave the example of a manufacturer that was automating their assembly line using robotic process automation, didn't pay appropriate attention to quality controls, and as a result, product quality decreased, costs increased. And then the third example I just mentioned is the one that's most relevant today, which is protecting against the changing cybersecurity landscape. And today, our homes, cities, infrastructure, medical devices, toasters in our kitchen are all internet enabled. They're all at risk of cyber attack. There's increasing automation being used in these attacks, AI, botnets, Internet of Things, to both facilitate attacks and to protect against attacks. So we need to be continuously revisiting our cyber risks and the controls that we have in place to monitor cyber risk. It's an interesting report if you want to look at some of the other emerging risks in the digital era. So there's all this change going on with digitalization, with new risks and so on. There are also changes going on in the organization itself. We no longer have the situation where there are clear boundaries around an organization. Every organization, modern organization, has a very wide range of suppliers, vendors, partners, consultants, contractors, subcontractors, agents, intermediaries, and so on. And increasingly with digitalization, all of these are using critical and sensitive data belonging to their customers. So there is increasing risk in the global supply chain. This was a report I found from McKinsey in 2020. Really interesting report, I think, and it sort of maps on the vertical axis the magnitude of potentially very serious shocks to the value chain. So these are events that could cause very serious disruption, and in terms of financial loss, they range from millions up to tens of trillions of dollars. And then across the bottom, we're mapping the lead time, the ability to anticipate these sorts of events, and that ranges from no notice at all up to months or more. And McKinsey plotted onto this chart various risks there. So at the bottom left, we have unanticipated business disruptions, such as theft, counterfeiting, common cyber attacks, such as SolarWinds or Kaseya that Doris mentioned, which happened a couple of weeks ago. Man-made disaster. As we go up, and sorry, those at the bottom, anticipated business disruptions, potentially causing impacts ranging from millions to hundreds of billions. As we go up, then we have unanticipated catastrophes, and some of this is getting quite apocalyptic. We've got meteorite strikes, solar storms, extreme terrorism, like dirty bombs and so on, but also systemic cyber attacks. So a cyber attack that perhaps disrupts the entire financial system, the power grid. Now, this hasn't happened yet, at least on scale. And incidentally, the colors of the dots indicate the historical frequency of these events. So black is more frequent, and then dark blue, light blue through to gray are those that haven't yet occurred at scale. But again, you can see systemic cyber attack, potentially going to get very little notice of that sort of attack if it occurs, but it could cause trillions of dollars of damage to the global value chain. Over on the right-hand side, then we see foreseeable disruptions at the bottom right and foreseeable catastrophes at the top. But we have acute climatological events, so the wildfires on the west coast of North America, flooding in Europe and China come into that category. Ever-changing regulation in various regulated industries, also the recent Biden executive order on improving US cybersecurity is going to have an impact as well. So interesting report, I think, very difficult to anticipate and protect and avoid these risks and these potential events to the global value chain, which is really emphasizing the importance to be prepared and try to be as resilient as possible to these types of events when they occur. Just over on the right-hand side, again, I found this really interesting. This is charting the expected frequency of disruption by duration. So estimating that disruptions lasting 1 to 2 weeks affecting the global value chain could happen perhaps every 2 years. Disruptions lasting 2 to 4 weeks every 2.8 years. Disruptions lasting 1 to 2 months every 3.7 years. And disruptions lasting more than 2 months every 4.9, so almost every 5 years. It's only a couple of months since the container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. The effect of that is still reverberating around industry at the moment, and there have been some quite well publicized disruptions to supply chain resulting from that. So a lot of change going on in enterprises, more and more dependence upon the global supply chain. But in addition to that, we're also seeing that there's increasing interconnectedness of risk. This was a report or a chart that came out of a webinar that Gartner ran in 2020, and it was looking at third-party compliance risk, and the question was, which third-party compliance risk has increased or could increase the most at your organization as a result of COVID-19? Probably unsurprising to this audience is that cybersecurity and data breach was by far the highest response there at 52%. And this was because many organizations were relying upon third parties, which themselves were relying upon a newly remote workforce. So compliance leaders were worried about cybersecurity risks from insecure networks within the supply chain. And you can see there are other concerns there as well: bribery and corruption, privacy, fraud, ethical conduct, and so on, were all other risks that were considered to have increased as a result of the pandemic. Now, it's not always easy to plan for these types of risks, and if we look back, put ourselves back 2 years from now, how many of us really were planning or preparing for a pandemic? We hadn't seen any sort of pandemic at scale in the West for many, many years. And I suspect that few of us were actually really anticipating that anytime soon. Probably even fewer were thinking ahead and saying, okay, if we have a pandemic, then what other risks might increase, or do I need to be worried about? And had identified cybersecurity and data breach and planned for that. So the increased risk of working from home. So we can't always anticipate and prepare in advance, but we can try to make ourselves resilient. And those organizations that were able to do that, that were either quite well digitized or understood the risks from working from home, had considered appropriate controls for working from home, perhaps educated their workforce and perhaps required the same for their critical suppliers. Those organizations survived the pandemic better, and in some cases accelerated during the pandemic. Others that weren't in that position struggled. And quite a good example, I was actually coming back from having received one of my jabs, and I was listening to a debate about problems in the pensions industry and pensioners receiving their pensions at retirement date. And the problem was that the pandemic had resulted in pension administrators working from home, they were finding it very difficult to access mainly paper-based records, which were in the office or in warehousing, and as a result, there was some serious delays in pensioners actually getting hold of their money. So huge amount of change going on, all quite chaotic. What I'd like to talk about now is just a little bit about the characteristics of cyber risk. Now, there are many factors that influence cyber risk, and it means that cyber risk is a continuing risk. It's not a one-off risk like a project type risk that we can assess and measure and respond to, and then review again in 6 months or in a year's time. It's a continual evolving risk, and just to illustrate that, every business or every organization has its goals. It has a number of critical business processes that deliver the desired business outcomes or objectives. And in order to do that, it depends on critical and sensitive information assets. And those critical and sensitive information assets depend upon other assets, such as applications, networks, third parties, and so on. And we'll come on to look at this. But the ability or our chance of achieving our business outcomes is influenced by cyber risk. And it changes all the time. So new threats emerge. So at the moment, the risk from ransomware is very, very, very high at the moment. So new threats can emerge, new vulnerabilities can be identified. Incidents might occur, which, while not directly increasing the risk, shine a light on the fact that perhaps the threat was higher than we thought it was, or perhaps controls are weak or missing. So leading on from that, if we have missing controls or we have weak controls, then our risk is going to be higher as well. So a number of things that happen that cause our risk to increase. Of course, we can take action to try and address some of these things. So we can remediate vulnerabilities. We can improve controls that were found to be weak through audit or testing, for example. We can implement new controls to address new threats. And this means that over time, our risk changes. It goes up and it comes down. And if we understand our tolerance for risk, then sometimes we'll find that we're below our tolerance for risk, but at other times we're above our tolerance for risk. And what does that actually mean? Well, if we're operating above our tolerance for risk for any length of time, then the chances are that we'll have some incidents, and the chances are that the impact of those incidents will be significant. So if we've budgeted and we've included in that budget a certain amount for events and issues and incidents and so on, but that overall budget is what we've set and what we expect to spend in order to help us achieve our business outcomes, then if we start to experience incidents with an impact above our tolerance for risk, then that's going to cost us more than we've anticipated. There might be additional costs in compensating customers, on reporting to regulators if it's privacy data, for example, or if you're in a regulated industry, there might be additional costs in legal fees and security remediation and so on. And of course, if our costs go up, and particularly if we suffer associated reputational damage, which might affect our customer churn rate or acquisition rate, then we could easily see that our business outcomes fall below target. So I don't think it's unreasonable to extrapolate and say that if we operate above our tolerance for risk for any length of time, then that's a good leading indicator of future problems, so going over budget and our business outcomes falling beneath target. There's one quite good example of this, which was the Equifax breach in 2017. This is a very serious data breach actually happened in the data was in the US, but it affected UK and European customers of Equifax. This was in 2017. In 2019, Equifax, the accounts for Equifax accounts for 2019 showed a $690 million charge for legal and investigatory costs and an 83 million cost for security transformation. And the impact on profits was a hit on profits of $556 million. So a lag in the impact on both cost and profitability of the organization as a result of the data breach. Of course, it's all quite a bit more complex than a simple slide can illustrate. But here, for example, we're looking at our critical and sensitive information assets being dependent upon a range of other assets, including people, process, technology, and third parties. And of course, all of these themselves can be subject to various risk factors. So our people, for example, could be targeted. They could be coerced, they could be bribed, they could be unhappy or disgruntled. So there's an insider threat relating to our people that we need to be conscious of. Our processes could fail or have errors. Our technology could be attacked, it could be misused or abused, or it could fail. Our third parties themselves use people, process, technology, and other third parties to deliver their services. So it's a complex web of dependencies. Okay, so we've talked about the problem. How do we go about solving it? How do we navigate all of this chaos? I think a good place to start is to talk about what we consider to be good security outcomes. And in my opinion, these are things like having resilience to loss events. So we can't avoid cyber events, data breaches, and so on. But we can try to make sure that they're within our tolerance for risk. And we certainly want to avoid cyber catastrophe. We want to make sure that our resources are used effectively and efficiently. So they're focused on the risks that could cause us the greatest harm and in proportion to the harm that could be caused. We want to make sure that our spending is optimized. So there's always pressure on budgets. We want to make sure that we're getting value for money for the spending that we are making on cybersecurity. We want to make sure that the need for investment is understood and justified. So if we're making a case for some new security products or services, data loss prevention, for example, something like that, then how can we justify that investment? What's the ROI for that investment? We want to make sure that strategic decisions are risk informed. That, as we saw earlier, that businesses are rushing to embrace digital transformation. There are new risks that we saw from the Deloitte report. Really important that the decision makers that are committing the business and the future of the business in terms of strategic decision making are informed on the risks that they're facing, and that they factor these into their decision making. And then finally, as cyber becomes an increasingly material risk, then it's important that the board and senior management have confidence that cyber risk is under control. Okay. So how do we go about delivering this and delivering these good outcomes? Well, the answer is to take a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. And I'm using a graphic here from a report by McKinsey, again, the management consultant, they surveyed and found that most organizations take what they called a maturity-based approach to cybersecurity. So that's in the middle on this slide. And the maturity-based approach to cybersecurity is all about building capabilities for security. So it would include things like building a security operations center, identity and access management, implementing multi-factor authentication, application monitoring, and so on. Now, the problem with this type of approach is that it can result in unmanageable growth because you tend to apply the similar approaches, similar processes, similar technology across the board. So all of a sudden, there's a queue for application monitoring to be configured on new applications. Results in unmanageable growth, escalated spending, and implementation gridlock, because we have a shortage of skilled technical resources that are able to implement some of these technologies. So as a result, dashboards are permanently stuck on amber. And you have to ask, does it actually really reduce risk? And in many cases, the answer is no. So McKinsey found a number of organizations that were taking a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. And this is the approach that we should aspire to. And this is focused on reducing enterprise risk. So it's about identifying, prioritizing controls that actually reduce business risk. It's about aligning cybersecurity with the enterprise risk management framework and businesses' tolerance for risk. It's about focusing on high-risk applications. It's about taking a pragmatic or developing a pragmatic program to ensure that risk is maintained within tolerance. It's about optimizing for risk reduction, resilience, and cost. And all of this requires a quantitative approach to cyber risk. We need to be able to measure risk in financial terms. We need to be able to base our decision making around some financial analysis, and I'll come on to that later in this presentation. McKinsey also looked at the difference in cost of risk-based approaches compared to maturity-based approaches to cybersecurity. I should point out that this was illustrative and sort of extrapolated from some real-world examples, but they looked at the costs of cyber risk management and governance, security organization, information security processes, technology controls for both key assets and non-key assets. And they found that by taking a risk-based approach, the costs were lower in all areas, with the greatest reduction coming in the technology control, costs of technology controls for non-key assets, and in cyber risk management and governance. So just very broadly, the ratio between the costs maturity-based approach compared to the risk-based approach was in the order of 14 to 5. And McKinsey concluded that we can actually reduce costs whilst increasing security, applying higher protection to critical assets for lower overall cost. So if we want to take a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, what do we need to do? What sort of information do we need to be able to understand and assess cyber risk? Well, I've tried to illustrate that on this slide, and in my opinion, this is the sort of minimum set of information that you need to understand in order to be able to have good contextual awareness of cyber risk. So in relation to our critical and sensitive information assets, we need to understand the threats to those assets, the controls that are mitigating those threats, how well implemented they are, how effective they are, any vulnerabilities that we have. And if we have high threats, weak or missing controls, and exploitable vulnerabilities in relation to critical and sensitive information assets, then we have a high risk, and we need to do something about it unless we're prepared to accept it. Now, it's not always that easy to assess threats, controls, vulnerabilities, and gain insight into that data. So we also need to look at other information that helps us to understand what's happening in practice. So things like test results from penetration tests, from disaster recovery tests, that sort of thing. Incident reports, near miss reports, issues, findings from audits, and so on are all good ways of shining a light on what's happening in practice. And then finally, if we've identified actions that need to be taken to reduce risk, then we need to complete those actions. They need to be completed, they need to be tested, they need to be signed off. Only when we've done that have we reduced risk. Otherwise, and we see this a lot, actions are raised, they just hang there, nobody's responsible, nobody takes accountability for them, they just sit there, and we're still at the same risk that we were previously. So all of this data is important, I think, to have a good contextual awareness of cyber risk. And of course, these all relate to each other. There's an awful lot of sort of cross-referencing. So if we had an incident, it might be because a threat was higher than we anticipated, or a new threat emerged that we hadn't anticipated at all. It might be because controls were weak, might be because we hadn't identified the vulnerabilities. The same can apply with findings from test results. It might require action to be taken on certain controls, certain vulnerabilities, and so on. So all of these sort of cross-relate, and in order to really have good understanding of cyber risk, we need to be able to correlate and understand in context. And that now sort of really takes me on to the next part, which is looking at 360-degree contextual intelligence on risk. And I'm borrowing here from a couple of slides used by an analyst called Michael Rasmussen, who works for a firm called GRC 2020. We've worked with Michael for about the last year now. We've done a number of webinars together over the last year on a whole range of different topics, and he's given me permission to use a couple of his slides. And one of them here is, again, looking at contextual intelligence. And in the center, we've got all of the different members, potential members of the extended enterprise. And around the outside, on the right-hand side, we've got risks, controls, issues, incidents, and so on that we've just been looking at, but expanded a little because we've been looking at cyber risk, and this is a bit broader, looking at broader enterprise and operational risk. But at the top, then, we've got linkage to objectives. And just going back to that chart where we illustrated cyber risk and business outcomes and so on, we need to understand our risks in relation to business objectives at the strategic, the departmental, and the process level. And ISO 31001, which is the international standard guidance on risk management, actually defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So to take that sort of guidance and best practice approach to risk management, we need to be linking our cyber risks to objectives. Of course, risks can apply at different parts of the organization, different entities, processes, and assets. We have various obligations to regulators, to customers via contracts, to our own internal values. There are various policies that we need to comply with that risk can impact on, so codes of conduct, policies and procedures, training and awareness. There are various roles involved in this process as well. So risk owners, subject matter experts, employees. So all of these need to be considered. These can all impact on our risk posture and understanding of risk. And just taking this one step further, this all sounds quite complex. There's a lot of data to consider. There's further data that's going to indicate our risk status. So what's happening as far as contracts are concerned, transactions, due diligence reviews, assessments, attestations, disclosures, quality audits, performance, sanctions, and so on. There's a whole range of different data points that potentially might trigger an alert about risk or might contribute to our understanding of risk. Now, we obviously, with all of these distributed, disconnected points, we need to try and make some sense of them. So we need to integrate and map together and provide the context. So this idea of 360-degree contextual intelligence is the ability to pick one of these data items and see everything else that relates to it. So if you're making decisions on risk prioritization or controls that we're going to address or audit findings that we're going to give priority to, then we have full visibility of all relevant information. We need to then analyze those relationships and understand them, and out of that then we can draw the number of action items that are really going to help us address our key risks of concern. Okay, and it won't surprise you if I say that the day of using spreadsheets to manage cyber risk or any operational or enterprise risk are really long gone, particularly with cyber risk, which is complex and has lots of moving parts and is continuous, as we've seen previously. We need to take a much more agile and much closer to real-time approach to assessing and managing our cyber risk. The same applies to enterprise risk, and I know a lot of organizations still track enterprise risks on spreadsheets, but as we'll see, we'll come on to very shortly look at quantification of risk. That really isn't a sustainable way of managing enterprise risk as we move into the digital era. Okay, so that's a nice segue into the next part, which is looking at measuring and analyzing cyber risk. And this is an area where we do see some need for improvement. So a lot of organizations simply plot risks on a heat map. This is okay for broad triaging, but it's not okay for decision making, prioritization, aggregation of risk, as we'll see. So in order to really understand cyber risk, we need to be a lot more realistic, and we need to understand that we don't know exactly what the cost of a cyber risk is going to be, but we do have an understanding of what it looks like. So this is a distribution, a typical cost profile of a cyber event or cyber breach. Now, there's been a lot of research that's gone into this, particularly in the insurance industry, and this is called a log normal distribution, and it's a good representation of the distribution of cost or impact from a cyber breach or cyber event. So there is a level of cost or impact that's most likely, but the impact could be less than that, and the impact could be higher. And in some cases, it could be a very small probability, but it could be very much higher. Now, very interestingly, I think, is that because we have a sense of the shape of the distribution of the cost profile of a cyber risk, then we only need a few data points. It's actually 3 data points needed to be able to understand and to plot this distribution. And those 3 data points are the lower bound, the upper bound, and the confidence interval. So if we're looking at, say, any sort of cyber event, whether it's data leakage, it's ransomware, it's hacking, for a particular event, if we're able to say that based on our incident history, for example, then in 90% of the cases, the cost is between $1 and $5 million, or $1 and $10 million, for example. That's enough to be able to plot the distribution of this curve. Okay. Similarly, there is uncertainty in the frequency of cyber events. So there might be there will be a most likely frequency of cyber events, but again, it could be lower and it could be higher, and we need to be able to recognize that as well. And this is called a Poisson distribution, and again, research has shown that this is the typical distribution for frequency of cyber events and losses. Okay, The Poisson distribution, incidentally, also works very well for frequencies that are less than 1. Frequencies of more than once a year, for example, so every 2 years, every 5 years, and so on. The great thing about taking this type of approach is that we can base it on what we're seeing in practice from our incident history, what we're seeing within the industry, what we're seeing within our sort of market sector, and so on. And we only need those 3 data points for the cost profile and an understanding of the most likely frequency in order to be able to then do some quite interesting analytics with cyber risk, because we can use Monte Carlo analysis or similar analytical techniques to generate this sort of distribution, which is called a loss exceedance profile. And this is plotting the probability that we're going to lose more than certain dollar values in a particular time period, so typically over the next 12 months. So to illustrate that a little bit more, this is a report from our Stream platform. So it's plotting exactly that, the probability of losing more than certain dollar amounts in the next 12 months. If I just pick 3 data points on this chart at the moment, what this is telling us is that based on our quantitative assessment of the risk, this is our risk profile, and currently at this point, it's saying that there's an 85% chance we'll lose more than $1 million in the next 12 months. This point is saying there's a 30% chance that we'll lose more than $3 million, or there's a 10% chance that we'll lose more than $5 million. This is a logarithmic scale across the bottom here. It's then interesting that we can map onto here management's tolerance for risk. And if I take the equivalent data points, then we can see here that there's a 25% chance of losing more than $1 million. Management's tolerance of risk is only a 25% chance of losing more than $1 million, or an 8% chance of losing more than 3 million, and a 5% chance of losing more than 5 million. So we have a problem. Our current risk profile is above our tolerance for risk. And as we saw earlier, if we're operating above our tolerance for risk for any length of time, that's going to have an impact on our budgets. It's going to have an impact on our business outcomes. So we need to take action to move our risk profile down to within tolerance. Okay. Before I go on to just talk about how we do that, one other point I wanted to illustrate is that this approach is really, really good for aggregating risk. So this is another example, and here we have a risk distribution for France, for UK, for Germany, and for Italy, and then they're all aggregated up into a risk profile for Europe, which we're comparing against Europe's tolerance for risk, which is shown by the dotted line here. Now, this is applied at the regional level. It can be applied at any level. So you can aggregate risk across different business entities, processes, different assets, parts of the supply chain, and so on. So it's a really, really good way and statistically sound way of aggregating risk. And you just can't do this with a heat map type approach to risk management. So the number of times I've heard arguments about how many amber risks make a red risk, or if we've got 5 red risks, which of them is really the highest risk. And it's using unsound math when you start trying to make decisions like that using qualitative heat maps. So we need to think, if we can, about moving towards quantitative ways of assessing risk. And of course, we can set different tolerances at different parts of the organization as well. And this is representative of what happens in practice, that different business entities or different regions have different tolerances for risk. So how do we then translate this into action and some priorities? Well, the great thing about qualifying and a quantitative approach to risk is that it's representing what we're seeing in practice at the moment. So it's representing losses that we're suffering through incidents. It's representing near misses. It's representing what's going on in the industry, obviously within the context of your own organization. And it's also representing the controls that we have in place to mitigate risk at the moment and the health of those controls. And because we've got this correlation, this 360-degree correlation, then we can pivot things around and we can look at things from a controls perspective. And so we can say, for these controls that we're concerned about, which of them are highest priority for implementing and for dealing with. And the example here is looking at a number of controls, 4 controls: standard configuration, patch management, privileged access management, and anti-malware within Chicago banking operation applied to different assets. And we can see that these controls have varying levels of deployment. And we measure deployment on a scale of 0% to 100%. 0% is not in place, completely ineffective, up to 100%, which is fully deployed and fully effective in terms of its objective. You can see we've got various states of deployment for these controls here. They're protecting against a number of different risks. And you can see here that because we have this contextual awareness and we have this linkage between risks and controls and other data items, then we've pivoted around and we're able to automatically estimate from our quantitative assessment the risk delta that we could typically achieve, the estimated risk delta from improving these controls from their current state of deployment up to fully and effectively deployed. Okay, and these are listed in order of risk delta priority. We've also linked here, or sort of included here, the cost of improving these controls, remediating these control weaknesses, and the final column therefore then gives us the ratio between the risk delta and the cost. Okay, if we want to sort by risk delta over cost, then that's the bottom part of the chart here, and you can see that in terms of risk delta, then standard configuration and patch management were the 2 highest priority controls to address. If we're doing it by effective ROI type calculation, then it's privileged access management and standard configuration might be the 2 that we would choose. Okay, so I think this is a really powerful way of making the most of the linkage you have between risks and controls and the 360-degree contextual intelligence. We can then map and model these changes back onto the risk profile. So here we see the original risk profile, the dark line to the right. We see the tolerance for risk, and then the blue distribution here is modeled the effect of strengthening our standard configurations and patch management. Okay, and if we were to go further and strengthen privileged access management and anti-malware, the other 2 controls, then we would get down to our green line or green distribution just here. So again, very powerful way of illustrating and demonstrating the effect of taking action to reduce risk. We can fold this sort of information into business cases and ROI calculations. So we're looking at reducing the probability of suffering intolerable losses down to below tolerance, and we can compare that against the cost of taking the action, do some financial calculations, and make a business case for it. Okay, finally then, just move on to say a little bit about implementation. Before I do that, I just wanted to draw a couple of what I think are very important conclusions. First of all, these days now, cyber risk, because of its materiality, is very much an enterprise level risk. It needs to be treated as an enterprise level risk. It needs to be reported as an enterprise risk to the board and to senior management. Secondly, the organization is not bounded. It's ever increasing to the extended enterprise. As we digitize more, we become more and more dependent upon the extended enterprise, entrusting them with our critical and sensitive information assets. And things change continually and quickly. So we really need to need to get a grip on this situation. In my opinion, we shouldn't be treating cyber and enterprise risk differently in different silos. We shouldn't be treating our internal approach to risk management, so how we handle risks to sensitive information and critical data that we are in control of and hold internally, any differently to how we're addressing it across the extended enterprise. So we shouldn't be treating those in silos. We need a consistent, holistic approach. So how do we take this forward? Well, we need an approach to risk management which is much more real time. It's much more adaptive to change. It can react quickly and it can give management the information they need to make critical decisions. If we're hit by a significant event, then even if we're not prepared, we have the information, the contextual information available to quickly understand the situation, to work out our priorities and the actions that we need to take so we can quickly remediate the situation and keep ourselves resilient and in business. So clearly, if we're implementing this sort of approach, we need a strategy which connects business functions with common governance framework and policy and gives us transparency and consistency across the organization. We'll need processes to implement the strategy, which are typically a subset of business processes. It'll include things like ongoing contextual monitoring of risks, regulations, the business environment, the technical environment. It'll involve identifying and onboarding third parties and other members of the extended enterprise. It will cover things like communications and attestations. It will cover metrics and reporting, reevaluation, renewal, and offboarding of vendors. So there's an awful lot there. Really, really important is having a flexible data model. So we need a data model that can link all of those different components together that we looked at, that can react to changes in process, because believe me, they will change. Processes will change. It will be a mistake, I think, to simply automate existing processes in the expectation that they won't change, and develop a data model that supports only existing processes. We need to be much more reactive than that. If regulations change and we need to capture additional data and we need to factor that into our compliance reporting or our risk management, risk assessment and risk management, we want to be able to do that quickly and in an agile fashion. And I've separated the data model out from the technology platform that will underpin it, but the underlying technology platform also needs to be flexible to support the flexible data model. It needs to provide the analytics of the type that we looked at, for example, Monte Carlo analysis. It needs to provide the dashboarding and reporting, the integrations with other platforms such as ERP, vulnerability management, security ratings, solutions, and so on. So I hope I've given you a sense there of just how much change is going on at the moment in a whole range of areas: digitalization, new and changed risks, the enterprise is changing, risks themselves have many, many factors associated with them, particularly cyber risk. These change all the time. It's really important to understand and visualize our risk in relation to the business's tolerance for risk. We need to collect the relevant data, link it together so that we have this 360-degree contextual awareness of risk. And if we do that, I think we'll be in a much better position going forward to exploit the opportunities from digitalization and also to protect ourselves against the types of disruptions that we've seen all too frequently over the last couple of years. There are a number of resources, if you're interested, available from Acuity. We call this the wheel of applications. We've been talking mainly about cyber and IT risk management at the top, and enterprise and operational risk management. All of this is available as a single. All of the applications that you can see on here are available on a single integrated platform from Acuity. So we've built Stream as this integrated platform. So there's no risk that a module won't interwork and relate with other modules. And we think it's a mistake actually to, as I think I said earlier, to treat enterprise and cyber risk and internal risk and external risk in different silos. They're all part of the same thing, and you need a consistent, holistic approach to address that. Please do have a look at our website if you'd like further information on all of this, or if you'd like to request a demonstration. There are white papers, a whole range of other webinar recordings that you're very welcome to watch on the website as well. Just draw attention to a couple of resources on the website. Michael Rasmussen, who I mentioned earlier, wrote an independent review of our platform stream. It was called Developing 360-Degree Contextual Awareness and Clarity to Risk. That's available on the website. It's also available on this portal if you'd like to download that. And then we've been talking about a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, so perhaps this white paper, 7 requirements for a practical risk-based approach to cybersecurity, might also be of interest. Finally, before we go on to questions, please do contact us if you'd like to discuss anything arising from this webinar. If you'd like to see a demonstration of our stream platform, and as I mentioned, the white papers and the webinars are also there for you on the website. Okay, let's, I think that's probably drawn the presentation to a close. I'll hand back over to Doris and we'll just go through some questions that have come in.
Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this session so far, and it's clear that Simon's presentation has raised some interesting questions, particularly around risk quantification. So this first question that I'd like to raise is risk quantification being used much for cyber risk, Simon?
It's increasing, Doris. We're seeing a lot of interest amongst our customers. It's an increasing requirement for prospects that we're talking to, and it's because as cyber risk becomes more material to the business and more existential to the business, then the business is demanding to see numbers. As I mentioned in the presentation, historically the approach has been to use qualitative heat maps. These don't aggregate. It doesn't allow you to compare easily against financial tolerance for risk or to do ROI type calculations. So I think it's, to be fair, most organizations are in the process of transitioning from qualitative to quantitative risk assessment, and they're starting to use quant for the highest risks or those where a business case is required for investment. And within our platform stream, then we provide options. So we provide support for either qualitative or quantitative or both on a sort of risk by risk basis. So a lot of organizations have a sort of history and legacy of a qualitative approach, and we can support them through the migration to a quantitative approach.
Thanks for that, Simon. That definitely provided a bit more insight into the, I guess, the rise of risk quantification being used for cyber. So I also wanted to ask, obviously this 360-degree holistic awareness of your cyber risk status is, the goal. It's the ideal, but how long does it take to implement this 360-degree awareness?
This really depends on the approach that you take and also the platform that you use to implement it. On our stream platform, then we've built the data model with 360-degree contextual awareness in mind, so everything maps to everything. So we can link objectives to threats, assets, controls, vulnerabilities, incidents, issues, audit findings, actions, all of those data points that I showed on the slide there, and we can pivot to any of them. As we showed in the demonstration, we can look at from a controls perspective at the risks and so on. And it's also very easy for a customer administrator to add new entity types resulting from change. So, for example, if we want to add in recording of complaints or investigations, inspections, sanctions, that sort of thing, because new regulations require it, then it's very easy for a customer administrator just to configure those, and they're there and available immediately. And they can then be linked to risks, controls, actions, and so on, and overlaid with the appropriate workflow, dashboards, and reporting. But to come back to the question at the start, how long does it take? I mean, typically with our platform stream, it will take a few weeks to a few months to implement this type of 360-degree awareness. I mean, that obviously partly depends upon having strategy and processes broadly understood, but we can implement quickly, and very importantly, it's agile, so that we can make a start, implement something, and if it changes, we can very quickly adjust to reflect the changes and move forward.
Great, thank you so much for that, Simon. I think that definitely provided more clarity again around these key topics. And once again, for anyone wanting to, witness the power of our award-winning platform stream and delve a bit deeper into the capabilities for, this 360-degree view of your cyber risk status and risk quantification as well, please do book a demo with us. Ask us any questions that you may have. And thank you so much for attending today and for engaging with us, for asking questions. And please do fill in the survey at the end of the webinar. It would be really nice to hear what you thought and what you'd like to see going forward. Thank you, Simon, once again, and thanks everyone for attending.